And we're kicking off this list with the Attack of the Dead Men. Now, I learned about this from a song by Sabaton, awesome band, definitely check them out, but it's based on a real-life battle that took place between the Germans and the Russians in World War I. On August 6, 1915, the Germans had unleashed a barrage of poison gases on the enemy before beginning their advance. They didn't think they were going to come up against much resistance, if any at all, but they were wrong. From the smoke and ashes came several Russian survivors. They were coughing up blood and bits of their own lungs. Their skin had begun to decay. They looked like reanimated corpses, and the Germans immediately turned around and just booked it back where they came. They were so frightened that some of them became entangled in their own barbed wire traps, and the Russians started opening fire on the fleeing soldiers. World War I just sounded like literal hell on earth, and the Germans on that day probably thought they were actually seeing the dead come to life. Pretty horrifying. Number 9, Destinies of the Soul. I thought it was only evil books like the legendary Necronomicon that were supposedly bound in human flesh, but it turns out that this was a more common practice than you might think. Destinies of the Soul, published at some point in the 1880s, is just one of the many books that were bound in human skin back in the good old days. And where does this book sit now? Harvard. It's been there since some point in the 1930s. Bound with Human Skin by Dr. Boland, who wrote on the inside stating, "This book is bound in human skin parchment on which no ornament has been stamped to preserve its elegance. By looking carefully you easily distinguish the pores of the skin. A book about the human soul deserved to have a human covering. I kept this piece of human skin taken from the back of a woman. It is interesting to see the different aspects that change this skin according to the method of preparation to which it is subjected. The practice of binding books this way, it was known as something I can't pronounce." Look it up there. Maybe we'll just write it. I'm not going to bother. It's going to take hours. Anyway, it dates back to the 16th century. Next up, we have the Champawat tiger. In the late 19th to early 20th century, this tigress was responsible for the deaths of an estimated 436 people in Nepal and the Kauman area of India. And that's single-handedly, mind you. This tiger was basically the real-life version of Shere Khan. At the time, her natural habitat was being destroyed to make way for farmland and timber, and many of its natural food sources were being hunted by humans in large numbers, so food was a bit scarce, and in response the tiger decided to just eat humans, and it did. Now, tigers don't often hunt down humans and eat them, but in this case she didn't really have much choice. In 1907, the rogue tiger was finally shot by Jim Corbett, an Indian-born British hunter and tracker. This tiger wasn't the only one he hunted down either. He was a colonel in the British Indian Army and was often called upon to track and slay man-eating tigers and leopards, but none were as tough as the Champawat tiger, who holds the record for the highest human death toll of any single animal. Next up on the list is Tarare. He was a guy from France in the late 1700s who became famous or infamous for his super disturbing eating habits. He had this crazy appetite and would eat tons of food, even live animals. He'd gobble down a whole bunch of apples, a meal meant for 15 people. He'd even take to devouring cats and dogs. Tarare didn't stop at regular food though. He once ate a live eel whole and even swallowed a snake after taking off its skin. Doctors and curious people began taking note of him, trying to figure out why he ate like he did. They thought something might be wrong with his stomach that made him feel full and just never gain weight. At one point he was hospitalized, and his disturbing behavior just got worse. He was once found eating parts of corpses and drinking human blood. The mystery was never completely solved, and he eventually passed away when he was 26. And at number 6, we have Ancient Teeth Whitener. Now, this one's just kind of gross, but if you're looking to whiten your teeth and you're on a budget, could be worth a try. Just don't say I recommended it, because I am not. So the Romans used to use urine to whiten their teeth. They dilute it with water or goat's milk, and I don't know, I guess swish it around like mouthwash. The thing it's as nasty as it sounds. It did apparently work. There is ammonia in urine which acts as a cleansing agent. You can find ammonia in cleaning products like glass cleaner, for example, nowadays. Now, I'm not sure what they would have done about their breath. Not much point in having pearly white teeth if you smell like number one. It's kind of weird to think that if you saw someone back then with a nice set of exceptionally bright white teeth in their mouth, you'd think like, man, that dude swishes a lot of pee. Were people like grossed out back then too? Where they're like, oh, here we go again. Gotta whiten these teeth. Things I do for these champas. Or were they just really casual about it? I'm starting to realize why this fact wasn't brought up in school. First of all, you'd never be able to get the class under control. You know, some kid would try it as a dare. The parents would be like, what are you teaching our kids? It would be a whole thing. Number 5, the headless chicken. This whole incident began in 1945 in Colorado. A farmer named Lloyd Olson tried to lob off the head of one of his chickens because it was time for dinner and his wife was going to prepare a meal for his mother-in-law. Most of the head came off, but he missed the jugular and most of its brainstem was still intact. He attempted to prep the chicken for dinner, but it was still alive. So instead of trying again, he decided to just take care of it. He used an eyedropper to give it water and would feed it small bits of corn and grains. But this day would change the course of both the Olsen family and the chicken forever, as this headless bird would soon skyrocket to fame, becoming known as Mike the Headless Chicken. Together they toured the US, with Mike being showcased in freak shows and circus sideshows, which I think are pretty much the same thing. He was photographed for magazines. Everyone wanted to meet Mike the Headless Chicken. Chicks wanted his autograph. He was a sensation for 18 whole months before finally dying in 1947. The Blood Eagle. So this was a form of punishment carried out by Vikings, and it's pretty brutal. The Blood Eagle was a practice used on particularly bad enemies, traitors, or those who were deemed dishonorable. The recipient of this lovely procedure was restrained, laying face down on the ground. On their back, they would have the image of an eagle with its wings spread out, carved into them. Then the victim's ribs were separated from the spine and kind of splayed out. So in the end, they'd almost have this appearance of wings coming out of their back. And finally, the lungs would be pulled out and like splayed over the ribs, which would kind of flutter in the wind like the wings of a majestic eagle. What a cool party trick. Sounds like a fun time to be alive. Next on the list, we have the tapeworm diet. This was a bizarre weight loss method popular in the early 20th century, which involved intentionally ingesting a tapeworm in the hopes of shedding weight. Advertisements claimed that the tapeworms would consume a portion of the food in the digestive tract, leading to weight loss without altering one's eating habits. Some people looking to lose weight could purchase tapeworm cysts, usually in the form of a pill from dubious sources. Once ingested, the tapeworms would grow and absorb nutrients from the host's food. As they matured, the tapeworms would reach several feet in length. Weight loss was just a side effect of malnutrition, and the body's struggle to absorb nutrients effectively due to, having a tapeworm in their stomach. This was obviously incredibly dangerous. There were complications, including abdominal pain and worse stuff. In some cases, of course, life-threatening conditions if the parasites migrated to other parts of the body, especially. And the tapeworms couldn't really be controlled or selectively removed once inside the body. And eventually, medical professionals stepped in and began to denounce the tapeworm diet as very risky and ineffective, and eventually the sale of tapeworm products started to decline, thankfully. Number 2, buried alive. Now, this is one a lot of you may know about already, but people used to get buried alive a lot, and not always on purpose. This macabre occurrence stemmed from a lack of medical understanding and limited technology. The 18th century saw especially a rise in cases of mistaken death due to various factors, like certain illnesses, accidents, comas especially. Medical professionals of the era really struggled to accurately determine whether someone was actually dead or not, leading to premature burials. Graveyards became the unintended scenes of horror, as unfortunate folks were laid to rest before they were actually dead. The fear of being buried alive was a very real concern in society at that time, which led to the invention of various safety measures to prevent people from dying in their graves, which is an odd sentence to say. Some coffins were fitted with bells or strings attached to the deceased's finger, which would be pulled from above ground in case they woke up. Then hopefully a gravedigger would hear the bell and race over to dig the person out. And coming in at number 1, we have mummy medicine. Mummy medicine was practiced for hundreds of years and involved using ground up mummy remains in medical remedies. European apothecaries believed that powdered mummy could cure various ailments due to its perceived mystical and restorative properties. The main source of these mummies was, of course, Egypt, where preserved corpses were plentiful due to natural dehydration in the dry climate. Mummies were ground into powder and added to medical concoctions believed to treat conditions ranging from epilepsy, stomach disorders, and the demand for mummies was so high that sometimes led to the deliberate plundering of ancient Egyptian tombs. And despite this widespread use, mummy medicine lacked any real scientific basis, and over time, as medical understanding improved, the practice fell out of favor. And we're starting things off with a weird one. Did you know that there is one instance of a person winning a race after they died? Frank Hayes was a horse trainer and jockey who in 1923 entered a race at Belmont Park Racetrack in New York. The horse was named Sweet Kiss, but got a new nickname after the race was over, the Sweet Kiss of Death, and it never raced again. And that's because midway through the race, Frank Hayes suffered a heart attack and died on his horse. But Sweet Kiss crossed the finish line and won the race. Folks went down to congratulate him, and that's when they noticed his body was slumped over. He was pronounced dead almost immediately. Hayes had been under tremendous pressure to cut weight for the race. Supposedly, he'd gone from 142 pounds to 130 in a very short span of time. Some articles even say he'd lost the weight in just 24 hours. I don't think that's possible. But regardless, he definitely lost it far faster than he should have. At number 9, we have helium. Apparently, Earth is running out of it. This is a bit of an issue because helium has a big role in various technologies. There's a growing demand for helium. It's used in MRI scanners, semiconductor manufacturing, and scientific research, and we're using it faster than it can be extracted. Helium is actually abundant in the universe, but it escapes Earth's atmosphere due to its lightness and just migrates into space. As a result, our supply here on Earth is finite and non-renewable. Right now, researchers are exploring methods of helium production, like capturing it from the atmosphere, although that process is pretty costly and pretty challenging. I used to get really freaked out by stuff like this, but I don't know. Now I'm just like, what am I supposed to do about it? Number 8, tersoriums. What is a tersorium, you ask? Well, this was a tool used in ancient Rome. You had a stick with a sea sponge on the end, looking a lot like a toilet brush. But these weren't used to clean inanimate objects. These were used to clean the rear end. Basically, toilet paper before toilet paper existed. Now, this doesn't sound all that gross at first. Nothing wrong with using a sponge to clean your butt. But when you consider the fact that these things were shared in public restrooms, yeah, that's pretty revolting. Now, it would be dunked in a barrel of water and vinegar afterwards to clean it off, but I mean, still, not sure how effective that would really be. And even if it was, let's just say that vinegar cleansed the thing completely. Just the idea, the principle alone of scrubbing your butt was something that who knows who else also used to scrub theirs. I don't care how supposedly clean it is. That should be for personal use only. I mean, just like your everyday loofah. All you do is scrub your body with that thing, parts of your body that are far more clean than back there, and I still only want to use mine. So the idea of this makes me sick. Let's stick around in ancient Rome for a bit, talking about their cure for epilepsy. Gladiator blood. It's pretty well known that gladiators were seen as these larger-than-life heroic figures, almost like superheroes of the time. And without any concrete medical understanding of epilepsy, it was believed that the life juice of a fallen gladiator would be drunk by someone suffering from the mysterious disorder to help cure them of it. This was most likely because gladiators were very strong and healthy, so drinking their red stuff was believed to maybe be a bit of an elixir, consuming their life force to gain some of the strength that they had in life. Sometimes the gladiator's liver would be eaten too. Now, of course, this didn't actually work. I'm not sure how long this practice went on before they would have realized that, but maybe there was a bit of a ceremonial aspect to it as well. This one is pretty gross, but not all that shocking, to be honest. Like, who wouldn't want to consume parts of a super elite sports hero when they die brutally right in front of your eyes, right? We all wish we could do that. Number 6. Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan helped the environment. Ruling from 1206 to 1227, founded the Mongol Empire through conquests across Asia and Europe. His leadership united nomadic tribes and created a pretty vast empire stretching from China to Eastern Europe. He was absolutely brutal, responsible for the deaths of an estimated 40 million people, according to a study by the Carnegie Institution for Science Departments of Global Energy. He and his army's destructive massacres were so significant that they may have actually reduced the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. This is because areas used for farmland or land that was once populated by people was allowed to grow back into lush forests, eliminating carbon by 700 million tons from the atmosphere. Now, did Genghis Khan do this intentionally? Of course not, but it just goes to show that even when things look completely dark and messed up, I don't know, sometimes there's a bit of good that can come from it, I guess. And at number 5, we have the Dancing Plague. The Dancing Plague of 1518 is a very bizarre event that occurred in Strasbourg, France. During the summer of that year, a woman known as Frau Trophy began dancing uncontrollably in the streets. She just wouldn't stop, and within days, other people started to join in and eventually formed into this mass of dancers. This event lasted for weeks, with a number of participants growing to several hundred, and the dancers experienced exhaustion, dehydration, and some even died. Doctors were pretty puzzled by the situation, but determined it was caused by overheated blood, and just sanctioned public areas for dancing to relieve the affected individuals. Nowadays, this is known as one of the most notorious cases of mass hysteria in history, an instance of mass psychogenic illness where some kind of psychological trigger leads to physical symptoms in a large group of people at once. But even till this day, no definitive explanation has been reached as to how this started and what was really going on here. Story has always given me the creeps, though. I wonder what I would do in this situation, right? Would I just look at them all dancing and scratch my head and then continue on with my day? Or would I become afflicted and join in? That's the question. Number 4, the Great Emu War. The American Civil War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam. We've all heard of these and many more famous wars from throughout history, but there's one that doesn't get mentioned all that much, but played a significant role in the history of Australia, the Great Emu War. Yes, the Australian population waged a war with these flightless birds, and spoiler alert, they lost. The unusual event took place in Australia during 1932. Following World War I, soldiers were given land in Western Australia to start to farm, but because of economic hardships, many of these farmers found themselves struggling, faced with crop destruction and land degradation caused by large populations of emus. The farmers requested assistance from the government, and in response, the government deployed soldiers armed with machine guns to help curb the emu population. And the war commenced in November of 1932, but proved to be more challenging than anticipated. The emus were quick and agile, and the soldiers found it difficult to get rid of them. After weeks of this intense warfare, the government decided to just withdraw the troops. The emus survived the war relatively unscathed, and the campaign was deemed a complete failure. And at number 3, we have the Green Children of Woolpit. This is a very bizarre tale. I'd never heard of this one before, and it was kind of a fun thing to read up on. The Green Children of Woolpit is a medieval legend that originated in the village of Woolpit, England during the 12th century. The story revolves around these two very odd young siblings, a brother and sister, who appeared in the village and they had green skin. They spoke in an unfamiliar language and wore strange clothing that the villagers weren't familiar with. They refused to eat food offered to them at first, but over time they started to adapt to their new environment. and their skin gradually lost its green hue. They learned English and explained that they had come from a subterranean world where the sun never shined and everyone had green skin. They'd been looking after their father's cattle apparently when they heard a loud noise and then suddenly found themselves in Wool Pit, and the brother eventually fell ill and died. The girl thrived though and went on to marry a man from the village and started a family. So where do you even start with a story like this? There are a lot of questions and only hypotheses about what actually happened here. One explanation is that the youngsters could have had some kind of condition that turned their skin green, right? Perhaps they were migrants who were abandoned by their family and their language just wasn't known at the time. Of course, there are more outlandish theories though, like maybe they were from some long-lost civilization that really did live underground. Some even speculate that they could have been an alien species from an alternate dimension. I mean, you know, just go nuts. Fun ideas. Obviously, there's nothing to really back that up, so all we know is that it's a very strange story from a very long time ago. And at number 2, we have a type of fish with human-looking teeth. So take a look at this. Yeah, that's real. Someone didn't just put a set of dentures into a regular fish's mouth as a joke. This is a sheep shed fish. It uses those teeth to chomp down on the shells of the creatures it eats, like mussels and barnacles and oysters. It's definitely unsettling to look at. Reminds me of that picture that's floated around online for ages with the teddy bear with the human teeth, or the smiling dog that looks like it has human teeth. It's just uncomfortable to look at. Don't like it. Finally, at our number 1 spot, we have the zombie ant fungus. Now, this is all gonna sound like something from a 1950s sci-fi monster movie, but it is very much real. There is a fungus called Ophiocordyceps unilateralis that is known to invade the bodies of ants, basically turning them into mindless zombies. When infected with a spore, the ant will start to behave strangely. Eventually, they'll be compelled to leave their nest and climb onto a plant stem. And then they'll ascend to the perfect height where there's the right humidity for the fungus to continue to grow. And the ant will cling to a leaf and remain there until a long stalk starts growing out of its head. And inside of this stalk are more spores. Spores that will be released and rain down on the uninfected ants below, infecting them with the fungus too, and on it goes. Life as an insect sounds absolutely horrifying. Not only are you under constant threat of massive sized predators, but you also have to worry about a fungus that can grow inside your body and take over your brain. No thank you.
Starting off at number 10, vampire killings. So starting us off, we have the supposed vampire killings from the 1800s. Now, spoiler alert here, they weren't actually vampires. Well, I guess I don't know that for sure, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and say they weren't. Anyways, back in the 1800s, people in New England believed that cadavers were rising from their graves at night and preying on the living. So to solve this problem, they began exhuming the cadavers. Now, some kept it simple and just turned the cadaver face down, but others jumped to more extreme methods like ripping the bones apart and rearranging them, or burning the deceased person's heart and inhaling the smoke. Apparently at the time, it was believed inhaling the smoke cured tuberculosis, though I can only imagine it made matters much worse for them. Some towns were so into the ritual that they would even hold festivals during the process and celebrate the exhumation and subsequent destruction of the corpses altogether. So while it was incredibly unsettling, they did truly believe they were vampires haunting them in the night, so I guess it gave them some peace of mind. Next up at number 9, dentures. While today dentures are made from composite resin or sometimes porcelain, during the 18th and 19th centuries, of course, those materials weren't available. But as you can imagine, people were still losing teeth at an even higher rate due to the high sugar diet, attempted teeth whitening, which was really just wearing away their enamel instead of brightening it, and the overall lack of knowledge around hygiene. So dentures were still needed and wanted by many. So what was their material of choice? Well, for the easiest and most profitable route, many would acquire the teeth from dead bodies. Although if you had some money, you might be able to afford dentures made from ivory. Other materials were sometimes the teeth of animals or wood, but honestly, I think we can all agree that none of those sound like terribly sanitary options, considering professional physicians at the time weren't sterilizing instruments and some didn't even believe in disinfecting disinfecting prior to surgery. Next up at number 8, stained glass. If you walk into just about any old church, you'll notice the walls are decorated with beautiful stained glass. But what might surprise you is that in some of the particularly older pieces, there is a strange ingredient that helps it all come together. In 1112, a German monk wrote about the process of creating the beautifully colored glass, and as he detailed, it starts off, innocently enough, adding sand and potash at a high temp until it becomes molten. From there, they'd add a stabilizer before coloring the glass with different metallic oxides like copper, cobalt, and gold. But once the glass was cooled and shaped, the small details were added by paint. They made the paint usually from lead or copper and would then suspend it in urine. So quite literally, some of those old stained glass windows were painted with pee paint, which I mean kind of just makes me giggle if I'm honest, but it is definitely a weird ingredient to think about being in paint. Coming in at number 7, leather-bound books. Nowadays, it's unusual to even find real leather on anything, but once upon a time, the leather on books wasn't even from cows. It was from people. Called anthropodermic bibliopegi, the books were made in a similar way as they would now, but obviously with one huge difference. They used human skin instead of an animal. While there are actually only 18 confirmed books of its kind that still exist, we have no idea just how many there could have been all those years ago. Allegedly, the books were usually made from executed convicts, and during the French Revolution, there were rumors that a tannery for human skin was established outside of Paris. I mean, it kind of gives me the willies to think about it, and I'm just glad we've moved on to a different material to bind our books today. Next up at number 6, Minnie Dean. Wilhelmina Dean, or Minnie as she was often referred to, was a nanny in New Zealand during 1880 and was a well-known caretaker in her town. But something was off with the woman, and soon she began having quite the dark spot on her name and career. In 1889, one of the young people under her care suddenly died, as if out of nowhere, and initially it was viewed as a freak accident, but 2 years later the same thing happened again. Now, with 2 minors perished under her care, police decided to investigate further into the matter. After a bit of sleuthing, it was concluded that under Minnie's care, the 2 minors were as she was attempting to take out life insurance on them. Police immediately took the remaining young boy in her care, finding it in dirty clothes and drinking curdled milk. By 1895, the investigation into her crimes continued, and she was spotted trying to flee on a train with another victim in her arms. And when police searched her house, they found 3 more covered up victims. Eventually found guilty for all her crimes, she was the first and only woman ever hanged in New Zealand. Next up at number 5, radiation test subject. In 1999, a man named Hisashi Uchi was a power plant technician, and he became known for being exposed to the highest amount of radiation of any human in history. While working at the Tokamura nuclear power plant, after a lack of safety protocols, improper training, and just an overall pressure to meet deadlines, Uchi and his coworkers made a terrible error. They mistakenly mixed an incorrect measurement of radioactive materials into the wrong tank, and as you've probably figured out, it caused a near fatal burst of gamma rays. Hisashi, who happened to be the closest to the incident, was brutally injured and sent to the hospital. Once he was there, it was discovered he had no more white blood cells, so essentially meaning that he had no remaining immune system. And despite being in intense pain with a rapidly deteriorating condition, doctors kept him alive under the family's request. So for 83 days, Uchi remained alive, being used as a test subject for experimental radiation treatment by the doctors, which, I mean, in their defense was the request of the family, but still, he endured several cardiac arrests, lost all of his skin, and suffered brain damage as well as organ failure. One of the last things Uchi ever said was, quote, "I can't take it anymore, I'm not a guinea pig." And then finally, one more cardiac arrest released him from his torture. Coming in at At number 4, mumia. Most widely practiced between the 12th to the 17th century, although there were a few cases in the 18th century that pop up, mumia was widely used as a means of medicine in many European countries. Now, if you can't tell by the name, mumia is creepily just as it sounds, the use of human remains to fix a living person's ailments. It was believed by many of the top physicians at the time that ingesting certain remains prompted the medicinal power of the mummy and could cure things like coagulated blood, pain, coughs, inflammation, cramps, and even heal open wounds. Now, they didn't just sit around eating the carcass directly. Instead, they would either grind the bones into a powder and drink it from there, or drink an extracted liquid from the embalmed individual. In fact, it was so popular at one point that it's believed the reason there are so few mummies these days is because of the high demand of flesh at the time. Coming in at number 3, James Jameson. One of the heirs to the Jameson whiskey family fortune, Jameson considered himself to be an adventurer of sorts and often traveled to far-off lands, detailing the trips in his diary. In 1888, Jameson decided to head out to explore the Congo, and while there he wrote about and demanded some gruesome things from the locals. So before beginning this expedition, Jameson discovered that the area he was visiting was known to have a population that participated in the eating of other humans. Apparently, Jameson set out to witness it firsthand, which, I mean, why was that his dream? A little suspicious if you ask me, but I digress. According to Asad Farhan, who was his translator for the trip, Jameson bought a girl from a trader of slaves for a few handkerchiefs and gave her over to the tribe to be. Allegedly, he didn't pay the tribe directly, but in a roundabout way, he did sort of pay to have this girl killed. What's even more gross is that he proceeded to draw and paint watercolors of the gruesome event while it happened, which again, just wrong on so many levels. Coming in at number 2, Cambodian Barbies. You may have been taught about the Khmer Rouge in history class, but if they don't ring a bell, essentially they were an extreme communist regime in Cambodia that held government between 1975 to 1979. They were known for being extremely cruel and committed some of the most horrifying acts of genocide in history, with nearly 2 million perishing under their ruling. Now, during their radical rule, the entire country was isolated from all foreign influences. This included closing schools, hospitals, factories, banks, foreign agriculture. They believed this would stimulate the rebirth of the country, but of course, all it did was send it into desolate famine and poverty. Led by a man named Pol Pot, the people of the country could not forage for food, despite the fact that everyone was starving, and anyone who disobeyed the orders was killed. Apparently, as the people became more and more desperate, they began to turn to folk magic, turning Barbie dolls into smoking talismans for luck. Thankfully, since its dissolution in 1999, all the leaders have been jailed for their atrocities, and the people are freed from the genocidal regime. And last up, in our number 1 spot, the Rabbit Woman. Her name was Mary Toft, and in 1726 she became known throughout Surrey, England as having been the woman who gave birth to rabbits. Now, I know what you're thinking, that isn't possible. And you would be right, but still the story of how she convinced people it was real was crazy. Apparently Toft was actually pregnant at one point, but miscarried, and it could have been this that sent her into her madness. Toft began declaring that she was giving birth to various animal parts, and so her local doctor became involved in the case. At first, everyone actually believed her, as in fact a rabbit did, well, come out of her. And with a doctor backing up her claims, the king and his royal surgeon got involved. Unlike her local doctor, the king's surgeon was skeptical, and after discovering corn inside the stomach of one of the rabbits and hay in their droppings, it proved the animal hadn't developed inside Mary. Eventually, Mary Toft admitted to the hoax and explained that she had manually inserted the animals inside her to make the delivery as realistic as possible. She was immediately imprisoned for fraud, and the medical community was ridiculed for having been fooled. Starting us off at number 10 is divorce. Well, today you can pretty much get a divorce for well, really any reason you want, that wasn't always the case. In fact, prior to being able to file over irreconcilable differences like most couples do now, pretty much only men were allowed to divorce their wives, not the other way around. Unless, that is, the wife could prove her husband's impotence, as it was seen as a woman's legal duty to bestow a child to her husband. If he couldn't give her the goods per se, she could file for an annulment of the marriage. But how did the court go about proving this, you ask? Well, of course they couldn't just take the woman's word for it, so they would bring in a witness, usually a sex worker, to try and arouse the man. That, or the court would enter your marital bedroom and, well, you know, see for themselves just how well the man could get the job done. If he did in fact have any issues completing his manly duties, the woman could be freed of the marriage. Just be careful they don't accuse you of becoming a witch. Next up at number 9 is man-made fertilizer. The Battle of Waterloo in 1815 resulted in the death of an estimated 60,000 soldiers, but not many of these bones have ever been recovered, and the reason why is pretty grim. In a strange, twisted series of events, the English decided to clear the field of the corpses and put the bones to use in a rather effective, but albeit creepy way. Newspapers of the time reported that the fallen French army were ground up in Yorkshire factories and the bone dust was added to their manure. Apparently the oil from the marrow proved especially helpful in the grave robbing turned fertilizer plan, and the fertilizer was purchased by farmers across England and scattered widely to help grow their crops, meaning that an entire generation of England ate food made possible with the help of dead French soldiers. Coming in at number 8 is Qin Shi Huang. Before the understanding of modern science, there was a lot of ideas about elixirs and remedies that have quite literally no logic to back them up. Now, of course, it wasn't their fault. They truthfully didn't know any better. But looking back, that doesn't make it any less wild. The first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, was one of the many intent on finding the elixir of immortality, and so he demanded his royal doctors find this magical potion for him, otherwise he would have them killed. I mean, just real low stakes stuff. Eventually, likely under the duress of not wanting to be killed and also probably not knowing what they were doing, they offered him a magic potion that they promised would bring him eternal life. The magic potion, however, was actually just mercury, and the emperor ended up dying from poisoning himself. A bit ironic that in the pursuit of eternal life, he actually only made his life shorter. Coming in at number 7 is Henry Rathbone. During school, we all learned about John Wilkes Booth, who assassinated President Lincoln at the Ford's Theater in Washington. But did you know that that wasn't the only tragedy to occur due to that night's events? In the theater with Lincoln that night was his wife, along with Henry Rathbone, a military officer, and his girlfriend Clara. At the time of the assassination, Rathbone saw Booth and tried to save Lincoln, but Booth stabbed him before he could reach the president. Although he physically survived the attack, he left with a deep-seated guilt about not being able to save the president's life. 2 years went by, and despite trying to move on from the tragedy by marrying Clara and starting a family, his mind never fully recovered and he became more and more paranoid about the world around him. He began claiming to hear voices speak to him from behind the walls that would taunt him endlessly, until eventually they pushed him towards complete breakdown. Convinced it was the only option, Rathbone shot and killed his wife before stabbing himself in an attempt to take his own. But just like before, he survived the attack on himself. Eventually he was tried for killing his wife and sent to live the rest of his life in an asylum. Coming in at number 6 is an animal trial. So not only did they have trials over the impotence of a man, believe it or not, you could also take a literal animal to court in the Middle Ages. I kid you not. The whole kit and caboodle would be present. A judge, prosecutor, witnesses, a defense attorney. They truly took it very seriously. The reasoning behind it all, I suppose, was that at the time, law prohibited punishment without trial for everything and everyone. The first recorded instance was the prosecution of a pig in France in 1266, accused of eating a young boy. The pig was found guilty for his crime and executed as punishment. If that doesn't sound crazy enough, keep in mind the judge would uphold the behavior of the accused animal against it. And if the court didn't feel the animal was acting properly, that was taken into account. These trials were only put on against domestic animals, as they truly believed, having been in the company of humans, they should know how to act. Now, not all animals were executed for their crimes. Some lesser criminals were merely excommunicated from the church or cursed and sent to live in the wild, but it's still crazy. I mean, honestly, I wish I was making this up. Coming in at number 5 is John Scott Harrison. Raised by the 9th President of the US, William Henry, and the father of the 23rd President, Benjamin Harrison, although John Scott himself never rose to presidential ranks, he did serve 2 years in Congress and was a prominent political figure in his time. But one day he decided politics wasn't really for him anymore and spent his last 20 years managing a farm in Ohio. After his death in 1878, his family gathered for the service and took great pains to protect his grave. At the time, grave robbing was at an all-time peak due to the demand for cadavers in medical schools. To avoid having his father be another subject of this, Benjamin had an unusually deep grave made and placed a massive stone that required 16 men to move placed on top of his casket. For extra measure, he then covered the whole ordeal in cement, then placed small wooden pegs below the surface of the covering so that he could tell if it had been disturbed. Oh, and he hired a security guard to watch it day and night for the next 30 days. After noticing a nearby family friend's grave had been exhumed, Benjamin and his nephew went to go and track it down. They managed to obtain a warrant for the Medical College of Ohio, and with the help of a detective went to retrieve the corpse of their dear friend. When they arrived, they found a dissecting room on the top floor, but to their surprise they couldn't find who they were looking for. Instead, they happened upon a body that looked strangely familiar, and when they removed the rags covering the head, they were horrified to discover it was the corpse of one Mr. John Scott Harrison. How the grave robber managed, we will never know. Next up at number 4 is La Costa. The Pax Romana is known for being one of the most peaceful times in history. The Romans had pretty much conquered what they set out to, and so they began to, just chill out for a bit. Then along came La Costa, esteemed maker of poisons and the world's first serial killer. Well, more like a hired assassin by the Roman Empire. Locusta was routinely caught poisoning people, and despite frequent arrests for her killings, was always let free. Why is that? Well, the Empire got word and decided they could use her to their advantage. Her first big gig came from Empress Agrippina to kill her husband, Emperor Claudius. Locusta complied with glee and assassinated the emperor. However, soon after, Agrippina threw her under the bus for the crime. But now, under the ruling of Lord Nero, he saved her for his own devilish plots. For the next 15 years under Nero, she worked consistently and was even awarded for her service. Locusta received a villa and even a small staff to help her in her poisonous endeavors. Nero even went as far to provide her with her own school for the profession. But after Nero was sentenced to death, Locusta lost her security blanket and lawful immunity and was executed by the emperor for her crimes. Coming in at number 3 is Gilles de Rais. Joan of Arc is, rightfully so, credited as a certified badass and patron saint who was a major defender of the French during the 100 Years' War. Among her most supportive and trusted allies was Gilles de Rais, an esteemed knight in the French army who was appointed the highest military distinction one could receive at the time. But if he was such a big deal and close companion of Joan, why isn't he as widely celebrated? Well, that's because sadly he was actually super evil. By day he was defending France beside Joan of Arc, but at night he was into the senseless killing of minors in occultist rituals. Often he would lure the unsuspecting victims in with psychological torture, convincing them that it was just a game, before bludgeoning them and doing other cruel and unspeakable things to their corpses, supposedly using them for his rituals. Eventually he was found out and tried for his crimes, admitting to all his vicious acts and hanged as punishment. Although no one knows for sure, it's suspected he had nearly 150 victims. Coming in at number 2 is virginity tests. Back in a time when a woman was merely the property of her husband, there was one very important thing that needed to be assured before the wedding night: that she was pure. Mostly because it was believed that the consummation in fact kind of sealed the whole husband owning his wife deal, and if she had done it with anyone else, she didn't really belong to him. Which charming. So to ensure that their potential wife was worth the dowry, suitors would perform virginity tests on their brides to make sure they weren't getting a second-hand woman, if you will. Such tests included inspecting their urine, as it was believed a virgin's urine would be clear. Other times they would give the woman a special potion, and if she could refrain from peeing, she was a virgin, as if a bladder was any indication of that. Sometimes a physician would be hired to inspect the woman's downstairs area, as they believed they could literally just tell by looking at it. Most common though was to inspect the sheets after the marriage was consummated. If there was blood, hooray, a virgin. If not, well then it was assumed she was a liar and her husband was legally entitled to compensation for being swindled into marrying her. And last up today are syphilis zombies. Sometimes it's easy to forget just how much antibiotics have changed the world around us. While nowadays a shot of penicillin can keep an early onset of the STI at bay, back in the day it could quite literally be the end of you. In fact, in 1494, Italy experienced one of the worst outbreaks in history, and if you didn't know any better, you might have thought it was a zombie apocalypse. Of course, before there was any kind of real understanding about how these types of diseases could be spread or caught, people were, let's just say, having a lot of fun with each other. But on the flip side of that, if they caught the infection, it would cause flesh to literally dissolve off their bodies until their inevitable death within a few months. It was also widely believed that bedding a virgin could cure you of the disease, so that's fun. Apparently, it was not uncommon to witness people missing hands, feet, eyes, noses, or look as if they'd been dropped into a vat of acid while walking down the street. Also remember that it took a few months before the disease actually killed them, so they were just living in excruciating pain while their flesh was slowly eaten away, in some cases right down to the bone. With that image in mind, it does make a little bit more sense as to why they believed you would go to hell for premarital relations. Like, I kind of get why they thought it was the devil punishing you for your sins. Thank God for antibiotics. Shall we? Starting us off at number 10 is the Judas cradle. The medieval times are known for a lot of stuff, and one of those is their insanely gruesome torture devices. Back then, if you'd found out you were facing the guillotine, you could actually breathe a sigh of relief, because trust me, there were far worse ways to die. One of these horrific devices was called a Judas cradle, and was used to interrogate prospective criminals into talking, and often would result in their death one way or another. Victims that faced this torture would be stripped of their clothing, bound, and then lowered slowly onto a pyramid-shaped spike that, depending on your downstairs parts, would be aimed at different areas, I'll just say. Any movement at all would only make the pain worse, so if you weren't telling them what they wanted to hear, they would often rock the victim back and forth, tearing them further open, and they would keep victims here as long as it took, sometimes even overnight. But what about the death part? Well, if you didn't die from injuries received during the torture, or frankly just blood loss, then most died from infection. You see, the spike was never really cleaned, so there was a whole horde of bacteria and disease that would settle onto the spike, inevitably seeping into the victim's nether regions. How fun, right? Next up at number 9 is cruentation. The Middle Ages had many interesting ways to handle justice, much of which I think we are all incredibly grateful is illegal nowadays. One of these such practices was called cruentation. Essentially, back then they believed that corpses retained a tiny spark of life after death, and so they were therefore revered as magical entities. Just imagining that they saw rigor mortis and decided that the corpse was somehow still alive. But how did this involve their judicial system? Well, with the idea of using the corpse's magical powers to their advantage, they would place an accused killer in contact with the corpse of their alleged victim. And if the corpse started spontaneously bleeding when the convict was in its presence, it was seen as confirmed evidence that they were guilty of the crime. This actually remained a completely legal practice until the late 17th century, but thankfully somewhere down the line they figured out that maybe a dead bleeding body couldn't be used as proof to convict someone of killing. Next up at number 8 is slug soup. Listen, I love just about all the creatures on the planet, and I don't have it out for slugs or anything, but I have never been able to look at one without feeling nauseous, so this actually actually sounds like a personal version of hell to me. During the Crusade battles, Muslims became popular for using aconite to poison the Crusaders. This was obviously causing quite an issue, as at the time there was no known cure. That was until one day when 14th century doctor Guido de Vigevano noticed some slugs munching away on an aconite leaf, and he had the biggest light bulb moment of his career. He collected slugs and boiled them before using the boiled sludge and turning it into a soup. First he tested it on animals, and after successful results there, he decided to try it out for himself. After a bit of trial and error, it turned out to make quite a successful antidote to the poison. But man oh man, does it sound incredibly disgusting. But still, better than being poisoned, I guess. Coming in at number 7 are transy tombs. In the Middle Ages, the practice of memento mori, meaning remember you must die, was huge. Memento mori was practiced in many ways: open caskets, churches filled with skeletons of the dead, and years later developed into things like photographing the dead. Their keen attachment to this philosophy likely stemmed from the sheer amount of people dying so frequently due to the overall lack of hygiene, so they had to come to terms with death in a much more peaceful sense than maybe we do now. One of their favorite ways to practice memento mori, however, was with transy tombs, which were funerary monuments that depicted the deceased in a stage of eerie decomposition. As you can imagine, they were costly, so usually they could only be resurrected after those with high standing or a small fortune in the bank. At the time, there was an existing belief that the earthly body was merely a transition vessel of the soul, and that after death the spirit would be resurrected. And so in creating these tombs that resembled the decomposing dead, they figured it would help the soul move on more quickly. And while I'm not opposed to all of the reasons behind it, from the modern lens, it is a bit morbid to have statues not only resembling the dead, but looking like zombies lining the streets, and I'm just glad this practice went out of fashion. Coming in at number 6 is bloodletting. Back in the day, the medical practice of bloodletting was used by medieval physicians, as they believed it would literally let the bad blood out of the body. This belief is mostly derived from the Greek physician Hippocrates and his theory of the 4 humors. The 4 humoral theory centered around the belief that inside the body there are 4 main humors, or liquids: black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm, and that any imbalance in these liquids was what caused health issues or even changes in temperament. So where bloodletting came in was that there was this belief you could let out blood in order to balance out these liquids in your body again. Now, while this theory was definitely a stepping stone in modern medicine, many argue could be considered a precursor to blood transfusions, the way that it was being done was without any real scientific backing, and without any understanding of just how much blood was safe to let out, or from what vein or artery was the safest. For example, people were so into the practice at the time that they would base which day was best for bloodletting on texts, usually advising to pick a saint's day. It was also popular to rely on charts showing which parts of the body were best to bleed from according to their zodiac. So as you can imagine, the practice did not always end well. Coming in at number 5 is Saint Francesca Romana. During medieval times, fornication in any other context than between a man and his wife, and for the purposes of procreation, was considered a sin, punishable by life in prison. Now, of course, there were many people that did not take this to heart, but there was one woman who very much did: Francesca Romana. For as long as Romana could recall, she always wanted to become a nun when she got older, but as happened all too frequently back then, her father forced her into marriage at the age of 13, as the man in question was extremely wealthy. At first she was incredibly reluctant, but after she allegedly received a vision from Saint Alexis, she changed her tune and became a dutiful wife, and even perhaps grew to like her husband. But this didn't change Romana's belief about the sins revolving what went on in the marital bed. So in private, wishing to remain spiritually chaste even if she couldn't be in her physical body, she would heat pork fat and burn her nether regions to ensure that she would remain in extreme pain throughout the act and never enjoy a minute of it. This was the only way she believed she could commit the act without sin and remain in the good graces with God. Coming in at number 4 is an arthritis cure. This one actually blew my mind when I first came across it. According to an 1896 news story in the Smithsonian, one day a drunk man was on a beach with some of his friends when he spotted a rotting whale carcass. Because he was drunk, he thought it'd be super funny to dive right into it. And he did. His friends waited for him and finally he came out, but he reported something incredibly strange. That his rheumatoid arthritis was seemingly gone. This sparked a national craze in Australia, and once word got out about the healing powers of the whale carcass, the town of Eden became a worldwide destination for people suffering from the condition. Visitors would be lowered into a freshly dead whale through a hole which would be sewn up, and it was advertised that if the person could stay inside for 20 to 30 hours, they would be cured of their pain. I have to imagine that you would need to be in so much pain to give this a try in the first place, because the thought of spending an entire day inside of a dead whale just seems wild. That being said, it's not all a bunch of hogwash. There is reason to believe that the rotting whale would have acted like a sweat box of sorts, potentially relieving some of the pain, but truthfully, I don't see how this could cause any kind of permanent fix. Let's just be grateful there are some other options out there today. Coming in at number 3 is a brutal execution. As has already been established, one of medieval Europe's most notorious strengths was figuring out the most gruesome way to either torture or kill their citizens. And if you thought that the Judas cradle was bad, then wait until you hear about this one. To be hanged, drawn, and quartered was a method of execution far worse than any other. At least with practices like the guillotine, it's over quickly enough, but with this one it was quite literally drawn out just to make you suffer. First off, the victim would be tied to a wooden panel and dragged, or drawn, behind a horse to their place of execution. Second, they would be hanged until the point right before they died. Then they would mutilate the body, often by disembowelment or emasculating it, while they were still alive before finally beheading them and quartering the body, meaning cutting it into 4 pieces. It was intentionally excessive, as this was a punishment saved for those who committed high treason against the king, and was used to instill compliance and fear in the onlookers. It was most popular in 14th century England, although it remained in the rotation of choices until it was abolished in 1870. Coming in at number 2 are changelings. Across Europe, there was an old belief in changelings, which were thought to be evil creatures left in place of young ones stolen by fairies. This was a huge problem for many reasons. Number 1, it was objectively not happening. You see, the main reason that parents believed their little ones had been swapped with a changeling was that their young ones suddenly fell ill, had physical deformities, behavioral changes like advanced knowledge beyond their years, or being mischievous. So essentially, if the young person in question got sick, became intelligent, had a disability, or acted like a normal developing person in any way, it was viewed as a changeling. Tragically, once it was believed that a changeling imposter was in their arms, there was only one way to handle the situation: hurt it in hopes that the fairies would come save the changeling and they would give their real one back. They did things like exorcisms, leaving them in the cold, poisoning them, or even trying to end their lives. And they believed that in doing this, their real little one would be returned to them. It may just be one of the saddest and most cruel practices to have ever existed. And last up, in our number 1 spot, are Ivy League photos. If you thought there was corruption in the high-ranking areas of society before this, then buckle up, because this one might be one of the most insane things I've ever heard. Apparently, for some time, it was actually required for students enrolling in Ivy League schools to have their photos taken in a grotesquely inappropriate fashion. To put it delicately, you were not allowed to be dressed. This dark underbelly came to light in the 1970s when a Yale employee opened a long, locked room and discovered thousands of photos dating back several decades. It was then uncovered that between the 40s to the 60s, it was a requirement to submit what they called posture photos, which were taken from every single angle and forced the subjects to attach pins to their spines under the guise of studying their spines. Some schools, however, practiced longer. Harvard, for example, began in the 1880s and got away with it until the 20th century. Of course, there was a huge investigation about this, and they found that the photos were used in various studies for big tobacco, or that they would use them in books for illustrations, but the creepiest was a professor that admitted the photos were used for for anthropological research and were used to study the connection between a student's body type and their intelligence, in what was basically glorified eugenics. Thankfully, most of these photos have since been burned. However, for some reason there are some that remain at the Smithsonian. I'm just grateful the practice of mandatory nude photos is banned, cause actually what the heck is that?
Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have lobotomies. Did you know that it used to be common practice for people to just get a part of their brain cut out? Okay, well maybe not common, but it wasn't as uncommon as you would hope. Lobotomies used to be considered an excellent and efficient cure for things such as mental health problems, which thankfully is a practice that has not survived for a very good reason. Of course, in modern medicine they do still exist, but only when actually necessary, and there is of course a lot more knowledge about the dangers and effects. One well-known person to have undergone one of these procedures was Rosemary Kennedy, who was John F. Kennedy's sister. She was experiencing seizures as well as mood swings, and while the seizures certainly were something that needed to be looked after for her health, I'm not sure if the mood swings necessarily needed some kind of medical intervention. Anyways, to cure her, they had a lobotomy performed on her. This procedure left her with the mental capacity of a 2-year-old, and she could no longer speak or walk properly. After this, she spent most of the rest of her life hidden away, and it was thought that her family did this because they were ashamed of her, which is both horrible and so sad. In our number 9 spot today, we have the English Civil War. This might be something that is taught more often in English schools, but admittedly it's something I didn't even hear mentioned throughout my time in school. This was actually a series of civil wars that took place between 1642 and 1651, and while it is often referred to as one event, it can be divided into 3 separate wars. These wars were mostly in relation to the manner of England's governance as well as pertaining to religious freedoms. The first war was from 1642 to 1646, and the second was from 1648 to 1649. Both the first and second wars saw supporters of King Charles I battling against supporters of the Long Parliament. The third war took place from 1649 until 1651, and this one saw the supporters of King Charles II fighting against the supporters of the Rump Parliament. In the end, these wars saw the execution of King Charles I, the exile of his son King Charles II, and the replacement of the English monarchy with the Commonwealth of England. There's so much more information about what went on and who was fighting in these wars, but I unfortunately don't have time to cover all of it in the short amount of time we have, but it certainly was a revolutionary period for England, Scotland, and Ireland, and it really was concerned with how these 3 kingdoms should be governed. In our number 8 spot today, we have William the Conqueror. This one is a bit more well known than some of the others on this list today, but I want to specifically talk about one thing in reference to this that is much less well known. In 1807, William the Conqueror decided to take on an all-alcohol diet. This is because he was suffering from extreme obesity and was struggling because of that fact. Because of this, he told his staff that he would only drink wine until his weight went down, but he ended up passing away less than a year later, and most of us are told that this was obviously because of the wine-only diet, but that's not actually true. In an astonishing turn of events, this wine-only diet actually worked. Shortly after beginning his diet, he was able to ride his horse again, which was one of the main reasons he started the diet in the first place, as he was previously too heavy for the horse to carry. He actually died after falling from his horse during an expedition, which was completely unrelated to either his weight or his diet. It's entirely possible that had he not gone on this diet, he would have never ridden his horse and maybe would have lived longer. Truthfully, who knows, but I suppose in a very roundabout way, he did still kind of die from this wine-only diet. In our number 7 spot today, we have the World War II dogs. A lot of us have learned quite a bit about World War II as it affected everyone at the time and was obviously a huge deal. We all have slightly different perspectives on it depending where you grew up and went to school, but it's something that is still widely talked about today. There is so much to cover on this topic, so of course some of it ends up getting left out of the history textbooks, but that doesn't mean the knowledge doesn't survive in some capacity. For today's list, I want to talk about a technique that was used in Russia during World War II that ended up completely backfiring. In Russia, they had trained dogs with bombs strapped onto their backs to run under tanks. I'd like to think that this technique also saw the dog being able to leave the bomb there so that they could escape, but that is most likely wishful thinking, but that isn't even what I wanted to talk about today. While this is, I suppose, a good tactic for fighting a war, there was one grave oversight during this training. All the dogs were of course trained using Russian tanks, since that's where and who they were being trained by, so when it came time for the real deal, These dogs couldn't differentiate between a Russian tank or an enemy tank, which then saw the dogs running under what they knew, which were the Russian tanks. Certainly not the outcome that they were expecting. In our number 6 spot today we have Mary Shelley. We all know Mary Shelley as the author of Frankenstein, but there's one super creepy and kind of sad thing about her that is much less well known. Mary's husband was a man named Percy, and when he was 29 years old he was sailing with 2 other men, and on July 8th, 1822 they got caught up in a storm and ended up drowning. The bodies of the men were found 10 days later, and they were only able to be identified based on their clothing. This of course is extremely tragic and sad, and of course it would have been so awful for Mary to have to lose her husband at all, let alone in this way. Percy ended up being cremated, and for some reason his heart was the only part of his body that refused to burn, which I guess now physicians suggest was due to calcification from an earlier bout with tuberculosis. While this in itself is pretty freaky, at first Percy's friend Lee Hunter ended up keeping his heart, but later it was turned over to Mary. Instead of disposing of the heart or doing anything normal with it, Mary ended up keeping the heart, and she carried it with her for years. No one knew about this odd little keepsake until a year after her death, when it was found in the drawer of her desk, wrapped up in the pages of one of his last poems. What a simultaneously heartbreakingly beautiful, but also ultra creepy story. The heart ended up being buried in the family vault with Percy and Mary's son after he passed away in 1889. In our number 5 spot today we have strange medicine. It's not necessarily uncommon for us to hear about strange things that people in the past used to do, but sometimes those strange things are also disgusting. It was extremely common in the past for people to use human remains as a form of medicine. You'd think at some point they'd realize that these remains truly were doing more harm than good. Well, I guess we did, but it did go on for much longer than it should have. The cannibalistic treatments would consist of things such as blood, ground up human skull, and even human fat. Tomb raiders would even steal remains in order for them to be sold to the wealthy, which is incredibly dark, and apparently mummy remains were the ideal remains for these sorts of things, which led to a shortage of mummies. I never thought I'd be in a position where I'd be talking about a shortage of mummies, but truly anything can happen over here at Most Amazing Top 10. I guess who am I to judge these past decisions, but all I can say is that I am very glad this is one we have moved on from. In our number 4 spot today we have the Chilean Civil War. Just to throw another war into the mix today, let's talk about the Chilean Civil War of 1891. The short of it on this war is that the president at the time, Jose Manuel Balmaceda, tried to give himself a lot more power than he probably should have had. The Congress weren't exactly thrilled about that, so they and the Chilean Navy rebelled against the president and the army. The Navy made the smart move by going north and seizing the nitrate mines, which were very economically important. From there they sailed south. Like any war, there of course was a lot that went on, but ultimately the Navy and Congress were successful and victorious. This war was actually the first war where modern torpedoes were used and were actually successful, although it took all of the torpedoes they had in just one attack. Part of the reason the Navy was so successful in this war because not only were they able to dominate on land, but also sea. This really led other countries to realize how vital it was for them to have modern ships and naval defenses. It also made other countries realize how important it was for them to have modern weapons. This war may be lesser known and less discussed, but it certainly was an eye-opener for a lot of other countries. In our number 3 spot today we have King Gojien of Yue. King Gojien of Yue had his reign from 496 BC until 465 BC. His reign took place during what was arguably the last major conflict of the spring and autumn period, and he was able to lead his state to victory, but it certainly wasn't an easy road or without some very creepy happenings. The major conflict he led his state through was the war between Wu and Yue, which started when a Yue princess, who was married to a prince of Wu, left her husband and fled back to Yue. I mean, this of course wasn't the only thing that caused the war, but it certainly sparked the fire. King Gojien was an extremely humble king, as he wouldn't relish in the riches he had as most royals would. Instead, he ate the same food as peasants and often would leave himself hungry in order to remember that he was in a position to serve his state. Okay, so you might be sitting there wondering when I'm going to get to the scary historical event that you came to this video for, so here it is. As I mentioned before, he was able to lead his state to victory, but of course a war involves a lot of sacrifice and some pretty horrific happenings. King Gojian's army was very well known for their ability military to scare their enemies before battle began, and this is because their frontline consisted of criminals who had been sentenced to death. In this time there wasn't lethal injection or the electric chair, so naturally it was a lot more of a vicious process. These criminals would decapitate themselves in front of the enemy army. Yep, I think this is probably the definition of a scary historical event. I can't even imagine witnessing something like that and then having to proceed with a battle against the army that has people doing that sort of thing. King Gojien was certainly not a leader who was wasting time messing around. In our number 2 spot today we have Topsy the elephant. Topsy was a female Asian elephant who was born in Southeast Asia around 1875. She was secretly brought into the United States shortly after and was unfortunately added to a circus who advertised her as the first elephant born in the US, despite that obviously not being true. During her 25 years with the circus, she gained a reputation as a bad elephant, and after she ended up killing a guest at the circus, she was sold to Coney Island's Sea Lion Park in 1902. The Sea Lion Park was eventually sold and renamed to Luna Park, and during Topsy's time here, she was involved in quite a few highly publicized incidents, which could be attributed to her drunken handler, the publicity-hungry owners of the circus, as well as the fact that this is all a perfect example of why animals that belong in the wild should be in the wild. In the end, all of the horrible people who had a hand in Topsy being in this circus decided that since she was such a problem, they would execute her publicly. They were going to hang her, but because people thought that that was inhumane, they decided to take a different route. For the record, I just want to say that the execution of Topsy was inhumane no matter what method they chose, because Topsy didn't deserve to be in this kind of an environment. On January 4th of 1903, Topsy was fed carrots that were laced with potassium cyanide, and she was also electrocuted and strangled. To make this horrific day even worse, the event was both spectated and the Edison Manufacturing Movie Company was there to film the whole thing. Many people believe Thomas Edison was actually there himself, but that is something that is up for debate. This whole situation is absolutely heartbreaking, and Topsy deserved a lot better than everything she had to go through. In our number 1 spot today we have the Red Summer. The Red Summer is something I didn't even hear mentioned in school, which is honestly absolutely shocking. I'm hoping this is something that is more commonly taught than I think it is, because it certainly is very important. The Red Summer is the term used to refer to the period from the late winter through to the early autumn of 1919, in which white supremacist and racial riots took place in more than 36 cities across America. Some of the more well-known race riots that took place during the Red Summer were the Chicago and Washington, D.C. riots, and the Red Summer also saw the Elaine massacre that took place in Elaine, Arkansas, which saw the deaths of between 100 to 240 black Americans. These anti-black riots are said to have developed from a multitude of post-World War I tensions, such as the economic slump and the competition in job and housing markets. In 1919, it certainly wasn't uncommon for there to be race riots and a multitude of white on black violence, but the Red Summer really marked some of the first race riots in which black people in number stood up to the white supremacy, resisted, and fought back. During the Red Summer, a civil rights activist named A. Philip Randolph publicly defended the right of black people to self-defense. It is said that between January 1st and September 14th of 1919, white mobs lynched at least 43 black Americans, but despite this, the states refused to interfere or prosecute these mobs. Considering how many race riots went on during this summer, we truly could dedicate an entire video to the Red Summer. It is insane to think about how recent 1919 really was, and while we certainly have come a long way, there is always more work to be done, and part of the work involves us learning about these horrible histories and what happened in our past.